I wanted to start off with this quote from Beauvoir, where she writes in an essay that was originally published in Flair magazine that's recently been published for a broader audience. It seems to me that the privileged role of love does not depend on this or that superficial structure of society. A much more fundamental explanation may be found in the ambiguity of human nature. And Sartre and Beauvoir both share, and I'll be talking about some of the things that they share within this presentation, also some of the ways that they're different. But one thing that they really both share is this idea that love is a fundamental relation to the other. In Being a Nothingness, Sartre calls it the most primitive relation to the other. And so I think a lot of times philosophers tend to see love as a sort of tangential topic. It's also been coded feminine typically, which has not been valorized as much in philosophy, right? There's a sort of exclusion of the feminine that has typically characterized philosophy, at least, in the past few hundred years, but arguably also before. But then, of course, we have a lot of really rich investigations into love from the philosophical tradition, including things like Plato's Symposium. So for Sartre and Beauvoir, there's really something particular to the relationship of love that discloses the ambiguity of human nature. And so what is that? Well, first, we want to talk a little bit about ambiguity. This may be a review for you if you've already been reading The Ethics of Ambiguity, but to just make this explicit, what Beauvoir means by the ambiguity of human nature is that there are these sort of two facets to the human condition. It's actually kind of weird to see her writing human nature here. I suspect that the quote here that I just cited, where she talks about the ambiguity of human nature, I suspect that's probably because she's writing for a popular audience. This was in a magazine. I think if it were to have been a philosophical work, such as The Ethics of Ambiguity, she perhaps would have used human condition rather than human nature. But in any case, what is the ambiguity here? So on the one hand, we have transcendence, right? This is basically more or less synonymous with our freedom. This is humans' ability, right, to not simply inhabit a given situation, but to move beyond it, right, to have a sort of relation, whether it's of questioning the situation, imagining it otherwise, acting otherwise than, is just reducible to a sort of natural process. That's the human facet of transcendence. It's also what Sartre and Beauvoir, following Hegel, call being for itself. There's a particular reflexive capacity to transcendence. And in addition to that, it's usually associated with subjectivity coming out of the phenomenological tradition. And then on the other side, we have facticity, which refers to our situatedness. And this could refer to the situated features of our embodiment, the situated features of our environment, of our identity, right? Our gender, racial identities, our cultural identities, the things that other people perceive, perhaps, or ways that we might be defined. And this, a little bit reductive here, but it's more or less associated with being in itself. The reason that's a little bit reductive is because technically being for itself transforms the very relation to being in itself, such that we're no longer being in itself. But that's a sort of heuristic here, is that it's equivalent to being in itself. And it also refers to our objecthood. And that's something I think is super interesting here, right? This idea that as humans, we are always already objects. For both Sartre and Beauvoir, objecthood is a pretty fundamental feature of who we are. To be treated as an object doesn't necessarily mean to be treated wrongly. It's simply a fact of perceiving other people. I think you see this in the look chapter in Being in Nothingness, that to some extent we're going to see them as objects because they're objects within our perceptual field. And so, yeah, just to sort of sum this up and then go a bit further. So according to Sartre and Beauvoir, humans are characterized by this dual condition of ambiguity. We are both free subjects for ourselves and situated objects for others. And this causes conflict. So although we experience ourselves as object for others, we can never know exactly how they see us. Feeling like an object is threatening. So we seek to escape this experience by taking hold of the other's freedom. So I want to first focus on why is it that we can't see ourselves as others see us, right? Well, to some extent, this is pretty intuitive, right? I can never get around to the other side of myself and see myself as the other sees me. And yet at the same time, and you really see this in Sartre's account of the look in Being in Nothingness, the look or the gaze of the other does really define me. It's not just as if I'm being reduced by the look of the other to some inessential feature of my being. Actually, the look of the other makes me feel like an object, and feeling like an object is a pretty important feature of who I am. I am an object for the other, but I can't know myself as an object. This is something that I've been really interested in this chapter, and that's the topic of the Philosophy Today article on Sartre that Jay mentioned that I recently published, which is that we can feel ourselves as objects for the other, but we can't cognitively know ourselves as objects for the other because we can't go around to the other side and see them as they see us. And for Sartre, feeling like an object produces the affect of shame, sometimes also of pride, but ultimately pride is even reducible to shame for Sartre. For Sartre, there's something that feels really icky about being an object. And so we want to escape this experience. And we do this by imaginatively taking hold of the other's freedom. For instance, by trying to see ourselves as they see us, or perhaps trying to reduce them to objecthood. So I exchange the look. I look back at the other and I say, no, I'm the sovereign subject in this situation, not you. And this pertains directly, right, back to the character of love. And so I said, a moment ago that ambiguity, this dual condition causes conflict, and it's especially a conflict between our feeling of subjectivity and our feeling of objecthood. And Sartre especially emphasizes the way that this plays out in love, such that love has a conflictual character. And Sartre's analysis of love and being nothingness is very interesting, and I think often overlooked or dismissed. And I'm by no means going to go into all of the complexities of it here, but I just wanted to draw out a few salient features of it for you. And so I have a quote here from Being and Nothingness, where Sartre says, "Love is the demand to be loved." For him, loving someone means wanting them to love us. And so there's something essential about love that involves a desire for reciprocity. In fact, it's perhaps reducible to the desire for them to love us. And the weird thing here is that in wanting somebody to love me, and he really goes back and forth between the language of want and the language of demand here. You find both in this chapter. And he says, by wanting somebody to love me, I alienate my freedom because I want them, to love me as a sort of fixed person in the world. I want to be adored, right? I want to kind of reduce myself to that objecthood. But I also desire that the other's freedom be alienated, right? Because if I'm demanding that somebody love me, in exercising that demand, I'm seeking to control them. And even more than this, because I want to be loved by the other person, Sartre writes here, this quote at the bottom of the slide, that he only wants the other to want to be loved in turn. Sorry, I think be loved is supposed to be two words there. It's not beloved. So he only wants the other to be loved in turn. Thus, love relations are a system of indefinite reference. So there's this very strange thing that happens where in demanding, if love is the demand to be loved, and I want the other person to love me, but love for the other person means that they're demanding to be loved by me. You can see how there's this just really essentially indefinite reference, this infinite regress this infinite regress, in a sense, like all the way down, right? In as much as in demanding to be loved, I'm demanding that the other demand that I love them. And they're presumably doing the same thing. So there's an essential conflict for Sartre in loving relationships. And we see a similarly interminable dynamic in sex for Sartre. I think in general, both Beauvoir and Sartre don't distinguish love and sex as much as we might do today, right? Their writings from the 1940s are indicative of a period in France where amour, right, is referring generally both to love and to sex, which you still see to some extent today, but I think the landscape has shifted quite a lot since, where there's been a kind of separation of love from sex in many cases. So for him, he does have different analyses of sexual desire and love, but they're in roughly the same area of being and nothingness in the concrete relations for others chapters. And they are often interwoven such that it's not super clear that he's talking about simply one or the other. So Sartre describes sexual desire as the attempt to grasp the other's free subjectivity by taking hold of the other's objectivity for me. So as I said before, in the same way that I'm an object for other people are also objects for me. And so in sexual desire, I want to take hold of the other's objecthood. But for Sartre, that can't be the whole story, because I don't want to just like treat the other person in the same way that I would treat like a can of soda. I treat them as a free subjectivity, but my way of trying to grasp their free subjectivity is precisely through their objectivity for me. So I desire the other as a body or object, but as a body or object that's peculiar in as much as it's always gesturing towards the other side of ambiguity, which is freedom. But the problem, right, is that it's through my body that I experience the other's body. And so I'm trying in sexual desire for Sartre to grasp the other as object, but only a subject can grasp the other as object. However, in trying to grasp the other as object, I have to play on my own bodily existence, my own objecthood for them. So the problem is that through my body, I experience the other's body as well as their desire for me. But in doing so, I actually end up reducing myself to a body or object of the other. And this is what Sartre describes as the problem of seduction. In trying to capture the other's subjectivity through capturing their objecthood, actually undercut my own ability to do that, because I'm reducing myself to an object and thus denying my own or alienating my own free subjectivity. And so yeah, if we were to put this schematically, we can say that in Being and Nothingness, although I said before, there's often an interweaving of the two themes of love and sex, such that they're not always distinguishable, there is nonetheless this key distinction that he identifies, which is that love tries to grasp the other as subject and sex tries to grasp the other as object. At the same time, though, I just want to flag here that this is a somewhat oversimplified way of putting it. I think it's heuristically valuable, but it's oversimplified in the sense that, as we just saw in the previous slide, sex tries to grasp the other as subject through grasping them as object, right? And I think you can say the same about love, where love also, love tries to grasp the other as subject, and maybe perhaps it's a little bit of, it's not entirely analogous, but there's still a relation of the other as object in love as well. So there's this kind of imbrication of the two, but love is more on the subject side and sex is more on the object side. And for Sartre, both are doomed to fail, right, in their projects. And Sartre gives many reasons for this, which I don't have the space to go into here, but the ultimate reason is that both of them are trying to reduce humans to one side or the other of ambiguity. In trying to grasp the other's object, even if my ultimate goal is to grasp them as a free subjectivity, I am reducing them to their objecthood. And in trying to grasp the other as subject, I'm reducing them to their subjectivity. So for this reason, Beauvoir is considered to be more optimistic than Sartre on the matter of love and sex. So in Sartre and Beauvoir scholarship, especially among scholars of Simone de Beauvoir's work, Sartre is seen as sort of fatally pessimistic in his view of love. And people are like, he didn't really know what love is because he just thought it was like this interminable conflict, this system of indefinite reference. And so it's a pretty standard view to say that Beauvoir is more optimistic than Sartre on the matter of love and sex. And the reason that scholars say this is that she thinks that love has the ability to preserve ambiguity rather than being an interminable oscillation between reducing the other to being an object and reducing the other to being a subject. Love involves, through the system, right, of indefinite reference, love is actually the situation that most clearly discloses ambiguity. Love involves being able to recognize both your own ambiguity and the ambiguity of the loved one. So I just want to note this passage, which I think is super interesting from The Second Sex. And I included the French here largely because I think there is a lot that gets lost in translation into English. So she says here, and I'll just go ahead and read it in English, but we can definitely unpack the French if we want to a bit. I'll say a couple things about that here. She writes, authentic love must be founded on reciprocal recognition of two freedoms. Each lover would then experience himself and as the other. Neither would abdicate his transcendence. They would not mutilate themselves. Together, they would both reveal values and ends in the world. For each of them, love would be the revelation of self through the gift of self and the enrichment of the universe. And so this is the more recent translation of the second sex, which is far more literal in this passage than the partially translation, which is the other translation into English from the early 1950s. The benefit of this translation are that words like reciprocal recognition or terms like reciprocal recognition are preserved. That's valuable because Beauvoir really means those terms in a technical sense. But what is really lost in any English translation here is the reflexive verbs, right? So we see here in the French, chacun des amants s'éprouverait, right? So that reflexivity, as well as aucun ne se mutilerait, that ability in French to figure beyond the binary of passive and active through the reflexive verbs, you just can't have in English. In English, you have to choose one, you have to choose either the passive or the active, right? And so we see that the translator has chosen to render these two verbs in active, which is fine. But I think what's so beautiful about reflexive verbs in French when it comes to ambiguity is that they are able to show both sides of the story at once. There's that duality that you just can't get in English because of the reduction to either the passive or active. And so what this passage really shows is that for Beauvoir, there can be a reciprocal recognition of ambiguity in a loving encounter, where I can recognize myself as subject and object at the same time, and I can recognize the other as subject and object at the same time, right? We're not abdicating our transcendence, and we're experiencing ourselves and as the other. And that this involves, as she says towards the end, the revelation of self. All right. At the same time, though, it's not a sort of cheery view that we get in Beauvoir. Like, oh, love is so amazing and wonderful, and it can just like reveal ourselves as gifts to the other and vice versa. Because most love, let alone, or not all love, right? Let alone sex. So most love, including most sex as well, does not involve an authentic recognition of ambiguity. And I will say that Beauvoir doesn't collapse love and sex. She acknowledges that there are forms of authentic love that are, not sexual at all, and also that sex can obviously be had without love. But I'm going to leave that sort of aside for now and just say that this applies to both the views of love and sex. But I want to focus especially on some of the claims that she makes in the Woman in Love chapter of the second sex. So here she argues that reciprocal love, the kind of love that she's talking about on the previous page, is almost impossible between men and women under patriarchy. So at least in a heterosexual context, this love is almost impossible to achieve. And she says in that same popular audience article that I mentioned earlier, It's Time Women Put a New Face on Love, she says, until now, our civilization has never known a love that was not founded on inequality. And inequality, of course, ultimately prevents us from the reciprocal recognition that she sees as being part of authentic love. And in her work, she focuses especially on two inauthentic manifestations of love that we see under current conditions, or what she describes as our civilization. So the first is devotion. And devotion, I know you've read some of the Ethics of Ambiguity, and so you may already have encountered this already, or I think it's also in Paris and Cineas addressed there. Devotion for Beauvoir is basically this ethical attitude of worshiping the other and sacrificing yourself to the other. And this, she thinks, is traditionally what a lot of women have been encouraged to do in relationships with men, largely because they were historically blocked from having access to their own transcendence through creating and establishing projects in the world. And so they would sort of seek transcendence vicariously through male partners. But devotion is really horrible, Beauvoir thinks, for both parties, because not only does devoting yourself to another person mean that you are undermining your own freedom and transcendence, it also ultimately means that you're undermining the freedom and transcendence of the other as well. Because in devoting yourself to another person, you are attempting to have some kind of control over them, really. You can see this in Beauvoir's fiction as well, in a number of her descriptions of maternal love and the kind of maternal love that she sees as sort of overbearing. She'll write sometimes about mothers who are so focused on their daughters that they won't really allow their daughters to experience their own free subjectivity. And so devoting yourself to another for Beauvoir is actually a form of trying to possess the other. That's really problematic. And then on the other hand, we have a second form of inauthentic love, which manifests in jealousy. And jealousy involves refusing to recognize the other as a freedom. So instead of reducing my freedom and living through the other's freedom, which ultimately alienates their freedom, I am taking myself to be the sovereign freedom, and actually, in many cases, collapsing my identity with the identity of the other person by refusing to recognize the other as a freedom. So for Beauvoir, jealousy most often manifests when we're jealous of another person's desire. We're jealous of a lover's potential desire for a third party. So this is something that she writes about in her novel L'Invité, for instance, which is about a ménage à trois that involves a woman feeling really jealous of her partner's desire for another woman. And the problem with jealousy for Beauvoir is that, in refusing to recognize the other as a freedom, we're actually showing that we don't really care about them in the way that we think we care about them. Underlying a lot of jealousy as well is the illusion of unity. So Beauvoir is very concerned with the way that the traditional way that a lot of people think about love, and you can find this in the philosophical tradition too, is in terms of fusing or unifying your identity with that of the other. And that kind of union, she thinks, is a recipe for inauthentic love, because the two people in a loving relationship, and of course there can be more than two in a loving relationship, but she's thinking about couple love especially here, the people in a loving relationship, are never going to be fully unified. And even if you're not thinking about desire for a third person, even if you're thinking about like attachment to a career or a desire to travel or any other kinds of values that might exclusively be, had by one party in the loving relationship and not all parties, that is a place where jealousy can potentially arise for her. And so for her, right, a lot of the problem comes from society's norms around love. And these include the expectations of marriage, monogamy, and heterosexuality. And instead of accepting these social norms wholesale, individual couples, she thinks, should discuss them openly and come to their own terms for their relationships. And so it's not necessarily that monogamy and heterosexuality are bad for Beauvoir. They're not like doomed to inauthentic love. It's just that they need to be really openly discussed, and partners need to decide what kinds of loving relationships they want to have, what kinds of norms they have, rather than just accepting pre-existing social scripts around monogamy and heterosexuality. Now, marriage is a slightly more complicated issue. I've been working on this recently because some Beauvoir scholars think that Beauvoir was just completely against marriage, in all of its forms. Certainly, she never got married and she chose not to get married. And she writes somewhat negatively about marriage in some contexts. And then others have said, no, she thinks, that's a perfectly fine choice for people to make if they want to get married. It's just not her choice. And in fact, it's kind of an interesting point related to this, that there are a couple of places in the second sex where the more recent English translation, not even the old English translation from the 50s, which you would expect to be a bit more conservative, but the more recent translation mistranslates some of the passages on marriage to make it seem like Beauvoir is only talking about certain kinds of marriages as, inauthentic, where she's actually referring to marriage as a whole. But she's somewhat equivocal on whether marriage can possibly be authentic, whereas monogamy and heterosexuality, she does think can be authentic forms of love. It's just up to the parties to sort of decide what recipe, to use a word from the ethics of ambiguity, they want to create around their relationship. And indeed, this is what Sartre and Beauvoir did in their own relationship for many decades, right? There's a passage in Beauvoir's memoir, The Prime of Life, La Force de l'Âge, where she talks about establishing a pact with Sartre at the beginning of their relationship, where they decide to be open, although they did have a period of monogamy for a couple of years at first. And their open relationship involved telling each other everything. It also involved living separately. So they never lived in the same apartment in Paris. but they considered themselves primary partners, whereas other partners were contingent. And so if we're thinking about this in terms of contemporary language around different loving relationships, they were in a hierarchical open relationship. They would not be what we would now call polyamorous, because they still had this essential relation to each other as primary partners, and other partners were considered contingent. Okay. And on this point, it was assumed for a very long time by Beauvoir scholars that she had been coerced into an open relationship by Sartre. And these scholars drew attention to the painful experiences of open relationships found in her fiction and memoirs, where she's really grappling with the challenges of having an open relationship, the jealousy that emerges, the devotion that is always a temptation. But more recent publications, including Beauvoir's diaries from when she was a student, have shown that even before meeting Sartre in her early 20s, she had already decided against marriage, and she was seriously interested in non-monogamy. And I think a more recent wave of Beauvoir scholarship, which is what I'm interested in, really suggests that the assumption that Beauvoir was coerced into an open relationship by Sartre is a pretty anti-feminist and unfair assumption to make, because it presumes that she was just like secretly wishing for marriage this whole time and going along with whatever he wanted. Whereas we, have evidence now to suggest that she was actually really driving a lot of these conversations, and she was invested in non-monogamy, and she had already decided prior to meeting Sartre that she most likely didn't want to get married. And so, to think about their views together, I think that the differences between Beauvoir's and Sartre's views of love are often overemphasized. So there is a sense in which Sartre's view is more pessimistic than Beauvoir's, given that conflictual character of indefinite reference that I mentioned. Beauvoir also sees love as largely conflictual, with most relationships lapsing into inauthenticity. And preserving the condition of ambiguity is exceedingly difficult. Beauvoir, however, emphasizes the socially and historically contingent nature of gendered love under patriarchy. And in this sense, I think her view is more nuanced than Sartre's. So Beauvoir was only really viewed as a philosopher, or brought under the aegis of philosophy within the past 20 or 30 years. And part of showing that Beauvoir is an original philosopher in her own right meant showing that she wasn't just a disciple of Sartre's, which is how she had previously been viewed. She was viewed, right, as a talented writer and novelist, but not as an original philosopher. And she, in fact, helped with this view by saying she was not a philosopher, saying that Sartre was a philosopher. And so in recent decades, Beauvoir scholars have really shown, like, no, she was an extraordinarily original philosopher, and we need to take her seriously. But in doing that, and that's a very important move to make, I think sometimes the differences between the two have been overemphasized, and we can still think about Beauvoir as an extraordinarily original philosopher, while also recognizing that she shares a lot of views with Sartre. That's something we do in philosophy all the time, is recognize that philosophers have a lot of overlapping commitments, even as they are original. I do think, though, that, right, the social and historically contingent nature of love that she addresses is extremely important and adds a specificity to her analysis that Sartre's view lacks. It also means, right, that we can move from this conflictual relationship of love that is overladen with gendered patterns to a more equal kind of relationship. So it encourages a move towards social change. Now, I think that for Beauvoir, there's always going to remain a kernel of conflict in love because of the very nature of human ambiguity. But it's certainly less, pessimistic than Sartre's in that sense. So I do sort of agree with the idea that Beauvoir is a bit less pessimistic than Sartre on love. I just think oftentimes she's seen as much more optimistic than Sartre is, and I don't think that that's quite right. So that's where I want to end today. I know we have ample time for question and answer. I wanted to, just give you a few reading recommendations of primary literature here, as well as secondary literature, including an episode of the podcast that Jay mentioned earlier, where we talk about open relationships and we address Sartre and Beauvoir's relationship. So thank you so much. And looking forward to talking with you now. I take the two in Beauvoir's work, at least, to be synonymous. I think to be authentic in the way that Beauvoir means it is to preserve ambiguity. And that involves preserving your own ambiguity and that of the other, because part of my own ambiguity is my exposure to other people, the way that they experience me as an object, but also the way that I experience them as objects. And so if I'm authentically recognizing myself as ambiguous, I am also by extension recognizing others as ambiguous. And so I would say that that's all Beauvoir means, to my mind, by authenticity, which is a little bit different perhaps than you might find in Heidegger or in Sartre. But it's, I think the through line with all of them on this topic of authenticity is that to be authentic just really means recognizing the human condition, like seeing it for what it is. And that means seeing oneself as a freedom, but it also, especially for Beauvoir, means seeing oneself as situated.
Yeah.
Sartre describes love as a version of the look, actually. And so pretty much everything that he writes about the look, we can also apply to his analysis of love. And one of the features of that is different from Beauvoir is that for Sartre, you cannot simultaneously feel yourself to be object and subject. You're, in a temporal sense, you're oscillating between the two. Whereas Beauvoir thinks, and she especially highlights the erotic experience here in some super interesting passages that I didn't bring up here that are in the second sex, that you can at the same time feel yourself to be both subject and object. Mm-hmm. But I think that one of the reasons for this is that in modeling love on the look, Sartre is specifically talking about the sense of vision. And even though the look or the gaze is meant to be more, it's meant to be broader than simply the sense of vision. He describes, for instance, hearing footsteps as a version of the look. I still think in framing the look or the gaze as our fundamental relation to the other, there's a presumed distance that's involved. And he thinks that you can never look and be looked at the same time. Even when I'm looking at somebody else, I'm either looking at them or they're looking at me. And I'm always like feeling that difference. I can't really have both of those feelings at the same time. Or I'm always feeling one or the other two of those, right? And oscillating back and forth. Whereas in Beauvoir, there's a sense in which there's a bit of a move from the look to the sense of touch. And in the sense of touch, we have an immediate reciprocity between touching and touch that we lack in the sense of vision. And this is something that not only Beauvoir writes about, but of course, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty in the phenomenological tradition also address, is this ability of touch to invoke an immediate reciprocity that vision lacks. So to that extent, I do think that Beauvoir has a more reciprocal view, or maybe, optimistic view of love than Sartre does. But I do think that even if love is primarily conflictual for Sartre, that doesn't mean that it's useless, impossible, or not worthwhile. Love's goal is impossible. It's unrealizable, as he says. The desire to alienate the freedom of the other while also preserving it as freedom, or the desire to be loved by the other, which is ultimately a demand to be loved. Those are in principle unrealizable. But to say that the aims of love are unrealizable isn't quite the same thing as saying that love is unrealizable. I think there's still a way that we can have loving relationships that fall short of their goal while still being worthwhile. And this is a pretty common theme actually in Being and Nothingness, where Sartre will also say that reflection is impossible. I can't ever get around to the other side of myself in order to see myself as I am. There's always a fundamental gap between the reflecting and the reflected that can never be bridged, that makes the aim of reflection impossible. I think I might have said reflection is impossible. And if I did say that, I want to clarify the aim of reflection is impossible. But this doesn't mean that we don't reflect all the time, right? And so we're, constantly trying to see ourselves as others see us. We're constantly tempted to reduce ourselves to a fixed set of identities. But then we're also torn in the other direction of wanting to be free. And so I think that for Sartre, most things are conflictual. And so I guess I would see him as like less pessimistic about love specifically. I think his views about love as conflictual are actually very much in line with other elements of his philosophy, which maybe I would just see as like not attempting to be pessimistic, but more just like recognizing this kind of weird nature of the human condition. A few aspects to that answer, which is, yeah, it's super great question. Thank you. So I think, the first response just within Beauvoir's framework itself is to say that for her, the temptation toward devotion is a fundamental aspect of love. And so the fact that so many relationships tend to involve devotion in her view today, or, in 1949, and also the fact that devotion tends to be highly gendered, those are historically contingent facts that have to do with patriarchy. But the temptation toward devotion itself, and this is also true of jealousy, those are baked into the very nature of love because they're reflective of ambiguity. For both Sartre and Beauvoir, we're always going to be tempted to reduce ourselves to either our transcendence or to our facticity. So there's that. But yeah, could devotion be something, could it be like, I'm hearing maybe a positive value, or at least like, less destructive than she's describing it. So certainly she wants to say no, I think, because devotion ultimately leaves both parties unsatisfied in her view. And devotion, again, as this worship or self-sacrifice to the other. What that means is that, right, in devoting myself to another person, I'm abnegating my own desires and projects. So I'm not giving myself space to develop myself in the world. But then also actually trying to exert control over another person in a really destructive way. It's something that the queer theorist Mari Ruti calls the praying mantis. And she's not talking about Beauvoir there, but I think that the ideal of the praying mantis is the ideal of the devoted one in Beauvoir's sense. So to that extent, like, no, there's no room for her. But to broaden out your question, one could argue that that's a product of Beauvoir's individualism or existentialism's emphasis on the individual in general. She is resolutely against the ideal of unity in love, right? She thinks that each partner has to preserve their own projects. Now, that doesn't mean that those projects aren't collaborative in solidarity with others, but ultimately, like, you have your freedom, I have my freedom, or not even have, because that's implying freedom's a thing, but like, you are freedom, I am freedom, and those freedoms are irreducible to one another because freedom is not a thing that could even be combined. So ultimately, the problem with union for Beauvoir is that we're imagining that selves are things that could even be combined to begin with. Whereas if we actually take the insights of existential freedom into account for her, there's no possibility of unity because there are no things to be unified. At most, what we could unify is our facticity, right? We could combine homes, we could combine values, we could combine friend groups, but we could never combine freedoms. And that, I mean, I think that insight is resonant with a number of insights in queer theory as well, which would emphasize the sort of empty signifier that is subjectivity and the way that subjectivity or freedom is not a heroic thing that we have. So I think there's kind of those two sides of it. On the one hand, this potential reading of Beauvoir's existentialism as resolutely individualistic, as failing to recognize the mutual imbrication of people, which I think queer theory and also, a number of non-French or non-Eurocentric views of love would emphasize. And then on the other hand, you can see this tendency in the claim that selves are multiple and also weirdly empty. That I think could be more compatible with some of these insights. And I think I'm not 100% sure. I think it's like either just one or the other. There might be bits of both in her legacy. Well, as with being in nothingness in general, there's sometimes a paucity of arguments to object to a contrary view. It's so weird with being in nothingness because in introduction you get this amazing argument against the idea that self-consciousness requires a kind of inner ego, but then beyond the introduction, there's like, so that's like a really compelling argument against the view that Sartre wants to present. But then in a lot of other places in Being and Nothingness, it's like assertions of his view with little engagement with potential counter arguments. But I think, for him, there would just be no possibility of a fully altruistic love, because the very nature of subjectivity is to want to be validated, to want to be recognized in the world. And I think that both Sartre and Beauvoir here are fundamentally reliant on Hegel's conception of the master-servant relationship, in which human consciousness comes to a sense of self-consciousness through its conflictual relation to another person, in which we're always trying to dominate one another. And in that sense, reciprocal recognition and a more ethical relationship emerges first out of a desire for sovereignty. And so I think Sartre would just say that the idea of completely voiding your own self-interest in love, for him, would be implausible. And it's not that love is necessarily always going to be narcissistic, although I totally hear your worry there. It's just that it's always going to have this core of wanting to be loved. But this might also, to go back to my thoughts in response to John's question, have to do with how we're seeing the self here. Because to want to be loved in Sartre's view, or to demand to be loved, is not reducible to demanding to be viewed as an object. Like, the ultimate goal is also to be recognized in my free subjectivity. And that's what's hard and for Sartre kind of impossible about this. Whereas narcissism really has to do more with your self-image being reflected back to you. And I think Sartre doesn't want, that's not the whole story for Sartre. It's not about your self-image or your objecthood being reflected back to you. It's about your fundamental lack. So like, I'm fundamentally lacking, another person is fundamentally lacking, and we want to like somehow recognize each other's lack and love each other's lack. And so like, I can see why that would be construed as narcissist in a sense, but it's also weirdly it speaks to the impossibility of narcissism, because narcissism, and this is sort of like me just riffing off of Sartre here, he doesn't say this anywhere as far as I recall, narcissism would have to do more with like wanting to be seen as a fullness or as a plenitude of being, as a set of characteristics, rather than as a freedom in process. Beauvoir, this is a major area of concern, because she sees romance, and so this is perhaps different from where you're going with this. It's like, could we see romance as a synthesis of the two? She's actually extremely concerned with romance, because for her, it's precisely the norms around romance in our culture that lead to the views that we have about love that are so inauthentic, including devotion and jealousy. So romance, tends to license jealousy or devotion. And she writes in The Second Sex about the rise of the romantic ideal in the 19th century, with like the model of companionate love, and this idea that romance precisely combines the higher passionate emotions of love with the quote lower, passionate lust for sex. And it also combines the desire for love with the desire for marriage, whereas she sees those two as pretty fundamentally incompatible. But love and sex are certainly not incompatible for her at all. I think a lot of times when she's writing about love, she is writing about erotic love without necessarily even explicitly stating it. And this is also true of Sartre. And so if anything, I've been kind of worried at times when thinking, is Beauvoir limiting our conception of love by conflating love with sexual love? A lot of the debates in contemporary ethics of sex and philosophy of love have to do with showing that we have overemphasized the sexual nature of love. And there's been a lot of attention to folks who identify as asexual or aromantic. And yeah, like this way that that we think about the two as necessarily combined. I think she does press on. So she says, for instance, that sex is most often the way that people experience their ambiguity in love, but it's by no means the only way, and that you can experience ambiguity in love without sex. In fact, there are moments in Beauvoir where her ideal of love is a lot closer to the ideal of friendship than it is to what we would think of as romantic love. So she sees romantic love as a new iteration of love that really comes up in the 19th century. And she doesn't use the word romantic positively in the second sex. She even says, I don't know, she'll talk about the way that the romantic is an error, but then she'll also say in the second sex that the romantic won't fade out of existence. So there's like this weird equivocal nature of her views in romance. I think certainly from an intuitive standpoint, the idea that romance is the combination of love and sex is still very much in play today. So I do think that makes a lot of sense. Her views specifically on romance are a bit strange though, because she sees that as yeah, in this particular way. I mean, I think the caress is really weird. And that, yeah, I'm thinking especially in like the sexual desire descriptions, because for him, so the cool thing, and this is like, I maybe need a little bit of a refresher on this point, but the cool thing I think about the view of the caress is that it's not just a way of touching the other person. It's also a way of allowing our embodied existences to spring forth. And that has a lot of resonances with the work of Merleau-Ponty and probably also Nancy as well, right? This idea that there's an originary co-creativity in caressing the other person. And he describes it as incarnating the other through the caress. And I think at the same time, there's ultimately a way that for Sartre, the caress, in some of the descriptions at least, does reduce to a kind of object, reducing the other to objecthood, where the caress is a kind of appropriation, which is also a word that Sartre uses in the context of knowledge, right? We gain knowledge about the other person through appropriating their body via the caress. And that seems a little bit different, where it's like a bit more on the selfish side, although at the same time to caress, it's not a simple desire for possession. And that also, I think, takes us a little bit back to Wade's question too, which is that one thing to add to that is that for Sartre, love is not primarily a desire for ownership. And it can seem at first like that's what his view is suggesting, because we do want to sort of alienate the freedom of the other or grasp it. But ownership, the desire for ownership that we see, for instance, through jealousy, is actually a derivative phenomenon for him. That's so interesting. I'm remembering that, yeah, like the examples of the body parts are breasts and buttocks, for instance, so very femininely gendered. But I also think, there's a very heteronormative dimension to the way the caress develops in Sartre too, because he doesn't see it as an end in itself. He thinks that that sexual desire, although it goes through this like medium of the caress, ultimately manifests in penetration. And so there is very much this sense of like, this is where sexual desire starts, and then it ends in the penetrative act, which is, I think something that a lot of feminists and queer theorists would take major issue with for good reason. And so if the caress, which is really this moment of ambiguity, although as you say, Maria, like it is also sort of undermined by this division into passive and active. If the caress is the most we get in terms of the ambiguity of touch in being a nothingness, which I think is right, what does it say about Sartre's view that the caress is only a kind of point on the way to penetration, where the passive active binary is really taking shape again in a pretty radical way? Yeah, I think perhaps her descriptions of the real carnal encounters of ambiguity mostly do have to do with touch, although she by no means develops like a philosophy of touch in an explicit way. She actually probably says even less about it explicitly than Sartre does. It's just that it plays, I think, a more instrumental role in her claims about ambiguity. But yeah, I mean, can the look deliver a sense of ambiguity? I think probably, especially if going back to Marie-Ève's point, we're seeing there's a sense of the body in movement, right? The look, even when I'm seeing the other as an object, I'm not seeing the other as an inert object. I'm seeing them as an object in movement or with a capacity for movement. So I think that could potentially work here. I actually I have a forthcoming article that I co-authored with the philosopher Caleb Ward, who works on sexual ethics and consent, on the nature of erotic objecthood. And we use Beauvoir in that article to say that I think in feminist ethics, a lot of times people take for granted that being objectified is a harm. And so if I'm treating a sexual partner as an object, then I'm doing something wrong. And obviously I understand where that viewpoint is coming from. You know, when it often is conflated with the idea that we're using a person as a means rather than as an end, or that we're seeing the other person as fungible, as an, you know, as a mere object in the world that has a capacity to be destroyed. And those are like majorly, you know, messed up ethical views, don't get me wrong. But I think that there's a dimension of erotic objectification that just happens routinely in erotic encounters that is not necessarily ethically problematic, and in fact can be a major source of pleasure and desire for people. And that's also something, you know, going back to John's much earlier reference to queer theory, that's something that a lot of queer theorists have talked about, is this desire to be objectified in a certain sense. And in that piece, we also draw on philosopher Talia May Betcher's account of having sex, the erotically gendered aspect of having sex, and in the fact that in erotic encounters, you're not only desiring the other person, but you're also experiencing yourself as the object of the other person's desire. And we're thinking about this in the context of queer and trans philosophy, which is the domain that Betcher's coming out of. It can be extremely affirming to be erotically objectified, you know, as a gender that you have long identified with, but often not been seen as, right? And so I think there's a sense in which objectification, if we're thinking about it in the simple sense of just like being experienced as an object by another, is not only morally neutral, but also can be morally positive and affirming for people, whether it's through the look. Betcher talks about the look. She talks about like looking at a woman's breasts and feeling both herself as desiring that woman, but also feeling herself as desired by her through the revelation of the breasts. Yeah. So I think, yeah, whether it's a look or touch or whatever it might be, objectification can be okay.